Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Tanya Luhrmann. She is the Albert Ray Lang Professor in the Stanford Anthropology Department. She is a medical and psychological anthropologist and also an anthropologist of religion. And today we're going to talk about her book, How God Becomes Real, Kindling the Presence of Invisible Others. So, Dr. Luhrmann, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on.
Yes, sure. So, before we get into the thesis of your book, let me just ask you one question, because I've already had several cognitive anthropologists or cognitive scientists of religion on the show, and there's some debate, particularly when it comes to if we're really biologically predisposed to religiosity, to believing in God and things like that. So, do you have a specific position on that debate? Do you think that there's some evidence that we might be biologically predisposed to being religious?
So I think that many cognitive scientists of religion have made a pretty good point that the way that our cognitive habits have evolved over time predisposes us to taking, sort of seeing agency around us. And so that's an argument that helps to explain why anthropomorphism is so common, so robust, so resilient in human life, that we sort of see faces in cars, on the fronts of cars. We see, you watch, a rectangle and a circle followed by another, a triangle and a circle followed by another triangle, and you immediately, they're moving around the screen, and you make up a story about, a couple pursued by a big man. And that's a real feature of human experience. Where I take off from, or the reason that I think that is insufficient as a full explanation of religion, is because I think that people are also good at basically seeing the failures of a quick intuitive reasoning. So, sure, you hear a sound in the next door, you quickly intuit that there's this presence or a person or an agent who caused the sound. But if you look next door and there's no person, no agent, you change your hypothesis. I think faith involves trying to sustain the sense that agents, invisible agents, are present, responsive, and salient to human lives. And that's the piece of the story that I try to tell.
Mm-hmm. And do people really believe in gods and other supernatural entities as easily as they believe in things that are immediately available to our senses, like any sort of physical object, for example?
No, I think they don't. I think you can show that this is true even when people assert that, they believe in God the way they believe the sun rises, the way C.S. Lewis did. One of the projects that I've been involved with is this year I've been working with Neil Van Leeuwen, and we talk to people, 5 parts of the world, and we're able to show that people sort of epistemically mark a difference between invisible beings and matter-of-fact claims. And so what do I mean by that? People use different verbs to talk about the realness of God's stuff and the realness of tables and chairs. They talk about thinking. You give people a factual sentence, and you give that I blank that it rained yesterday. People say that they think that it rained yesterday, or they know that it rained yesterday, but you give people the sentence that says, I blank that Jesus is my Lord and Savior, and people will use a belief verb. And people will do that in different social worlds with different degrees of education, with different religions. And it seems that that's this kind of, they mark a distinction. So you could say, well, maybe they take the belief stuff even more seriously. And in some ways, of course, they do. But, I notice that people never ask God to feed the dog, right? People never ask God to do things that ordinary human action can solve. They never ask God to write a paper. They might ask God to intervene in matters of luck or uncertainty or in moments of despair, but they're not. In many ways, they're treating God as if God is the secondary explanation. And of course, if you're a person of faith, you want God to be more salient. You want God to be more important. And so I see people going to great lengths to try to persuade themselves that God is involved with all things. But it's not the way people behave, really. And that's what the purpose, that's what the practice of faith tries to rectify, in a sense.
So what is it that in the book you mean by real making?
So I say that the big job of faith is to help people to experience God as real. And by real in this sense, I mean, not only people assert that God is real, that's an epistemic claim, but people feel that God is real. People have this kind of more visceral, more sensory awareness that there is this invisible being who's involved with their lives. And so I really start with two kind of analytic objects. I talk about the faith frame, which is, and I distinguish that from kind of the matter-of-fact world, the ordinary world in which we wash the dishes, feed the dog, put gas in the car, and the world of spirit, where people have a set of ideas about the kind of person you should be, that you should please a God, that the God has power. And I see these as two different ways of interpreting the world. And I see that the job of faith is to try to bring them closer together. This is what people say all the time, people of faith. They want to be thinking about God as if God is always present, but in fact, they're often not. So, I did all this work with evangelical Christians, but also with witches and Zoroastrians and a lot of people with different faiths. And what people would say all the time is, I go to church, I try to remind myself that God is really important, and then I get into the car and I forget all about God and I yell at the kids. I want to be more faithful, and I'm not as faithful as I want to be. So this idea that you're bringing these two frames together is something that people of faith really say. So I then talk about the second analytic concept that I use, called kindling. So kindling are these small acts of paying attention which help people to come to feel that God is, this invisible spirit is salient and involved in their lives. And so I point to a number of features of kindling that help people come to have this experience. And that's really what the book is about.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that it's as hard for people to believe in or to make big gods? I mean, I'm talking here about the concept used by anthropologists of religion and cognitive scientists of religion. Is it as hard for people to make big gods real as it is for them to make smaller gods real? I mean, in the sense that, would it be harder for people to make gods that are more abstract real than perhaps some that are even associated with elements in nature or something like that?
Yeah, so the big God, little God distinction, I attribute to Aronor Zion. And although you point out it's used more widely, and he is really distinguishing between gods that are not omnipotent and not omniscient, and not always benevolent, and Allah and Ahura Mazda and Jehovah, and they're the classic gods of what some people would call the axial age, although that's really not quite the right phrasing, but a God that is omnipotent, omniscient, and usually presumably benevolent. And I think there's a kind of continuum of believability. So if you have, on the one hand, you have like a malevolent ghost, and the malevolent ghost lives in a certain part of the woods and can, trip you, cause disruptions, cause you hurt. It's pretty easy to just avoid that part of the forest, right? There's something you might want to do because it sounds kind of scary, and it might not require that much work to avoid that part of the forest. And it is probably easier for humans to believe in something that hurts them than something that helps them, oddly, paradoxically. The people that, when you come to an omniscient God, there's an obvious awkwardness there's an obvious believability problem, which is how do you reconcile God's omnipotence and power with the difficult circumstances of human life. And then when I was spending time with evangelical Christians, which I did this long project with evangelical Christians that was culminated in a book called When God Talks Back. And I saw that the evangelical Christian God, believed in by many, many Americans, maybe a quarter of all Americans, although the numbers are a little hard to really feel confident about. This God in the early 21st century is a wonderful God. It's basic, that God is not judgmental, that God is a God of mercy, that God is presented as supremely powerful and supremely loving. And when I spent time in these churches, I could see that on the one hand, people would say, of course they would say, I believe in God, and they would recite these words repeatedly in it. But I also saw that it was hard for people to believe that it was true for them. That, in some sense, because it's so hard to really wrap your mind emotionally around a God who loves you unconditionally. And there are all these complicated things you could say about whether this God is truly loves unconditionally. But that would be the language that people often used. And I saw that when I was spending time with people, is that there would often come a moment where somebody would cry in our interviews. And often what they were doing was remembering what they sometimes called a precious moment, when the penny dropped, that they really got it, that God loved them the way they were. And the way they talked about this is that they got it, and then it disappeared. And I think that was, to me, was an indication of the challenge of really believing in a way that was viscerally powerful, that you were truly, personally, individually, uniquely loved by this particular God. So I think there is a range of believability.
Mm-hmm. What is the role that you think things like rituals, places of worship, sacrifices, etc., play in this sort of real making?
It's a great question. I think that in order for something to feel real, you need to be able to both place it in a cognitive frame, and you also need to have some experience with it. And so I think that rituals are crucially important because they give you a chance to interact with a God and to remember that you have interacted with a God. So, you've got this narrative frame, I talk about a good frame produces what I would call a paracosm, a shared imaginative universe. I'm not claiming that God is imaginary, but you've got to use your imagination to represent an invisible being. And so a good paracosm is really imaginatively deep. It has a lot of detail, and it and it lays out the rules in which you learn how to interact with God and to experience that God's response. Often that interaction takes place through rituals. So in the morning, you get up, you recite certain words, or you place something around your waist, or you take some beads and you put your fingers around the beads, or you go to an altar and you pour something out for God, and milk for the God to drink. And you do something that gives you not only a chance to experience yourself as reaching out to the God, but then you remember the fact that you did reach out to that God, that you've engaged with this God on many occasions, and it makes that God feel more concrete.
Right. So another hypothesis that you put forth in your book is that detailed stories help to make gods and spirits feel real. So could you explain what you mean by detailed stories and how detailed do they need to be to make gods and spirits feel more real?
I think it's a great question. I don't think that there's a simple answer, like you need 95 details to make God feel real. But I draw the reader's attention to this apparent paradox that books like the Harry Potter series, Middle Earth, the Narnia stories, they work because they give you so many details that you can remake the story for yourself. So if you are a Tolkien fanatic, for example, you will remember, Tolkien tells you that Frodo and Samwise are wending their way to Mordor, and it's been a really hard journey, and I think it's Sam catches a rabbit, and he pulls out his cooking utensils that he's carried all the way from the Shire, and he makes a little fire and he cooks the rabbit. And then this turns out to kind of alert Faramir to the fact that they're kind of in the woods thing. And so the story takes up. But that you can sort of smell the story invites you to smell the rabbit, to feel the heat of the fire, to remember the sight of what those cooking utensils are. And in an odd way, it's the detail that helps you to remake it as your own. So it's the detail of Harry Potter that means that people can, take the story and imagine what it would be like for them, that they're eating those Bertie Bott's, whatever they are, candies, that there they are in the room with Harry and Ron and their roommates, and there's this, and Neville, I guess, in the room with them. And it's providing the excess detail actually helps you remake it as yours. And you see this in the Bible. You see this in Bible study, that people who engage with it, go to Bible study, they have these stories that they encounter, and they remake those stories. They retell the stories as if it incorporates their life. They're reading a section of the end of the Gospel of Mark, and then they go looking for this, and Mark says, they shall, then they'll survive the bites of poisonous snakes. And then people go out and look who've never encountered a poisonous snake. They go out and imagine what would count as a snake in their lives. And so a good paracosm, a good narrative structure has many, many details that enable somebody to retell the story in their own way.
Mm-hmm. So, I would imagine that this process of real making is, at least in a way, intimate to each particular person. So do people of the same faith really believe in the exact same gods and other supernatural entities?
Oh, I don't think so. I think it's a great question. One of the things that I think is so interesting about studying religion is that you can hang out with people who are talking, using the same words to talk about their experience, but I don't think they always mean the same thing. And I think that they don't know that necessarily. I mean, I think you have a conversation with somebody and you use the same words, you sort of assume that you're talking about the same object, but I don't think you necessarily are. I think it becomes more and more personal. So one of my colleagues, Pascal Boyer, once talked about these religious terms as empty concepts. And that's not, just that doesn't, that the phrase makes some people uncomfortable. But what he really captured with that idea is that if we were talking about, if you and I were having a conversation about a zebra, and we would, over time, we'd probably get better and better at recognizing this real, animal with stripes on the fur and 4 hooves and eating habits and habits of hanging out in a savanna together. But with God, there's a sense in which people kind of use the term and know more and more about the term, and to some extent coalesce around a shared understanding. So in a church, there are certain understandings about God that are particular to the church, and people who don't like those understandings, people who don't, like people will use the word God wounded in evangelical churches to describe people who have what they would regard as the wrong concept of God, a God that's too punitive. But, because nobody in the group can point to this actual object, what they mean by God is a series of personal events which they remember, which coalesce for them, but their understanding of what it means to be loved, or what it means to be cared for, what it means to be, have a being who gives rules or demands certain rituals, or, sacrifice himself for you. I mean, those people, they develop very different, I think, understandings of what God really is.
Mm-hmm. Earlier, I've asked you about rituals, places of worship, and stuff like that. What about religious imagery? Like, for example, artistic pieces, paintings, sculptures. Do you think that helps in real making?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the more that the more anchors people have for their experience of God, the easier it is for God to feel real. And so one of the things that I was also able to show is that people who get caught up in inner imagery are more likely to have vivid experiences of God. And I think that having imagery provided can be helpful. I mean, I once tried to do a little experiment in which I was persuaded that Catholics would have more vivid visual experiences of God, and Christian and Protestants would have more vivid auditory experiences of God, because Catholics are really good at having lots of images of God, and Protestants aren't. Protestants often have an image free. They really emphasize hearing God. And I'm still persuaded there might be something to that, but it didn't pan out in the research. But yeah, I mean, when people have, because it's hard for us to hang on to abstract concepts, when there's something concrete, when there's a baby elephant, when there is, when there's an icon, when there is even just a text somebody can hold, when there's a prayer rug, when there are specific rules that you're following while chopping broccoli for dinner. Anything concrete helps somebody to feel as if the God is more real.
Mm-hmm. In the book, you also say that talent and training matter. What do you mean exactly by that?
So what I mean is that there are some people who are probably more able than other people to have vivid experiences of God. That's what my work finds. I'll explain that in a second. And when people practice encountering God again and again and again, they're more likely to feel that God becomes real to them. So the specific pieces of those stories that I studied was absorption and what I call inner sense cultivation. So people who, what do I mean by absorption? So absorption, I think, is an orientation that people have in which they are more able to get caught up in their inner imagery. And maybe they're a little bit more able to suspend disbelief as well, a little bit less likely to kind of to craft a distance from the story, the narrative they're engaged with. So absorption is the name of a scale that's got like 34 items. And you say, for these items, you say true or false. For me, this is, I can be, sometimes I experience things the way I did as a child. If I wish, I can change noise into music by the way that I listen to it. I can be, if I wish, I can make my body so heavy that I couldn't move it even if I wanted to. I can be greatly moved by eloquent or poetic language. So, exactly what does that pick up? We're not totally sure, but there are 34 statements like that. And the more somebody says, this statement is true for me, of these 34 items, the more they're likely to say that they have a personal relationship, that God feels like a person to them, that they have vivid experiences of God, that they have vivid spiritual experiences. They have, they seem to be able to experience this invisible other as present. Inner sense cultivation is the name I give to the practice of using the imagination to represent God. And you see examples of inner sense cultivation, what I mean by that is representing the narratives of the religion with all your inner senses, seeing, smelling, tasting, hearing, whatever, the story. And you see examples of inner sense cultivation in Tibetan Buddhism and in shamanism and in Kabbalah and in Christianity. The famous example in Christianity is the Ignatian spiritual exercises, in which Loyola wanted people to step into the scriptures and experience them as if they were real. And he didn't really care if you experienced them the right way. So, he really invites his exercitants to be present at the Annunciation. And he wants people to imagine, how old they think Mary is and how broad the road is on which she's walking, and is there are dust motes in the air. I think he has a scene in which he has people imagine Mary and Joseph taking off into Egypt, and imagine you're standing by the side of the donkey. Imagine that you're helping out Joseph, as he just wants you to use all your inner senses in order to experience being there. And one of the things that I have seen in my work is that the more somebody does this, and so I artificially manufacture this by asking people to spend a month in their life doing specific inner sense cultivation for half an hour a day. But in general, the more practice people have, the more they report that the invisible spirit seems present to them, that they have vivid spiritual experiences, vivid spiritual experiences of the spirit, that all this invisible stuff comes to feel more real.
Does the way people think about their minds also matter here?
Yes. So one of the things that I and the folks that I work with have done is to find that if you imagine your mind as more porous, and by that I mean that you imagine the boundary between the mind and the world is more open, is more permeable, as if, thoughts can leave your mind and enter the world, and thoughts from somebody else can enter your mind, the more you are likely to report that invisible others are real to you. And so it's sort of abstract, so can be a little hard to kind of wrap your mind around. But what I mean by this is, so I think at the heart of many religious ideas is this expectation that the mind is sort of open to the world. And so that's true in ideas about witchcraft. So that, at the heart of witchcraft is the idea that somebody's malice has a direct effect on the world. It's also at the heart of the idea of prayer. So even though we have a God who's supposed to be, in charge of how prayer works, we also have this model in which we also, most religions have this idea that prayer doesn't work unless it's fervent and intended. Like if you just casually ask God for something, it's not going to happen. So, what you really have to do is you have to really intend. And so there's this idea that intention affects something outside of the mind. So it turns out, that porosity is not the same as a religious commitment. It's related, but it's not the same. You can have a religion without porous ideas. You can have porosity without religion. But I was able to show that the more people imagine this kind of openness, the substantial quality to their thought, as if their thought could act on its own, the more they were likely to report that gods and spirits felt real to them. And so in that chapter, I report on this time I spent in Chennai and in Accra and in Christian churches like the ones I studied in Chicago and California. And I was really struck not only by the way people talked about gods and spirits, so that they talk as if gods and spirits are sort of more substantially present. They're also more likely, it could sort of show that there was, more commitments to porosity in Chennai than in the US, and more commitments to porosity in Accra than in Chennai. And people also reported increasingly more vivid sensory experiences of gods and spirits.
Mm-hmm. And does this way that people, or the way that people think about the mind, vary cross-culturally?
Yes. So I think that the people imagine the mind in many different ways across culture. I mean, so there's something kind of weirdly idiosyncratic about the way that secular Westerners imagine the mind. I think of it as, imagining the mind as a citadel on a hill overlooking a town. So we sort of imagine the mind as really, really, so this is what you might call the Charles Taylor model of the mind. It's really important. What you think is who you are. We have this idea in Western settings, in Europe and America, other Westernized settings, that, who you are an individual. What counts about you is your unique individuality. And what's crucial to that unique individualism is what you think, your inner ideas. We also tend to think that those ideas are in your mind and nobody's going to see them or understand them or think about them unless you tell them. And in other parts of the world, there's enormous variation, but in other parts of the world, there's often for example, in Vanuatu, where we did some work, your unique individuality is not really as important as who you are in relationship to other people in your life, to part of your community. In West Africa, one of the striking things about that world is the still prevalence of witchcraft ideas, that there are, that the inner world is dangerous, and it's dangerous because it can affect other people directly. So there are many different models. One of the models that we came across in Thailand was the idea that the inner world is sort of co-constitutive with an outer world. That so this somebody who worked with me called Felicity Aulina would talk about this as a kaleidoscopic model of mind, that the mind is always shifting, that what's in it is not really fixed, but that it's kind of karmically related to a moral judgment about your interaction with the world around you.
What are the psychological effects of prayer?
So I think that prayer is, or at least a lot of prayer, not all prayer, but the prayer in which people are just talking to God rather than reciting particular words. I think it often works the way that cognitive behavioral therapy works. If you think about it, so like cognitive behavioral therapy, this is a therapeutic practice in which people ask you to disattend to some thoughts in your mind that might not be so helpful, and to attend more to better thoughts. So if you say you have a problem with insomnia, your therapist, your CBT therapist will say, okay, in the middle of the night, you're thinking that this is a disaster, that you're not going to be able to sleep tomorrow. But in fact, if you teach or school yourself to say, well, I'll be a little tired, it's not a big deal, then things will go better for you. One of the things that happens in all prayer, in unscripted prayer, is that people are being asked to be grateful, to make a plan. They're being asked to turn their attention to the positive. And so it's working in many ways it's structured in many ways like CBT. It's sort of, telling you to be thankful for what you have rather than to be distressed by what you have. The other thing that prayer really delivers in many of these faiths is a richer relationship with God. And one of the things I really see in these religious practices is that God really does feel like a person for people after a while. And that's really powerful for people. It delivers to them a social relationship in a world in which, social relationships are good for the body, good for the person.
Mm-hmm. How do people develop their expectations when it comes to how and when gods respond?
So usually that comes both from the narratives that are popular in the religion. Mm-hmm. So these ideas about, a religion will tell people, when the God will, how to talk to God and when God will talk back. And they also come from the person's experience of interacting with that God. And then they remember their own experience of talking and responding to God.
Mm-hmm. Does religion have positive health effects? And if so, do they derive in any way from these relationship people establish with their God or gods?
So that's a great question. One of the robust findings of social science is a positive relationship between religion and health benefits. Mm-hmm. So Harold Koenig, for example, has this kind of huge handbook on religion and spirituality. He surveys in the last edition, he surveys over 3,000 papers, and over 2/3 of them say, yes, there's a positive relationship. And this is kind of measured in a bunch of different ways. It's measured differently in different papers. So, sometimes the variable is, do you go to some kind of religious service? Sometimes the variable is, how many hours a week do you spend in religious practice? Sometimes the variable is, how close do you feel to your God? So there are all these different measures in the papers. And then there are all sorts of different positive findings, like, immune function and cardiovascular function and mortality. So there are all these kinds of things. So what's really going on? So you've got this positive relationship that's pretty robust. Of course, not all papers find it, but there's a pretty positive relationship between religious practice broadly conceived and health of the body broadly understood. I suspect, so some people want to say, well, really it's about the social benefit of going to church or to shul or to a temple or to a congregation. And one of the abundant findings in social science is that loneliness is bad for you. Religion reduces your loneliness. I think that part of the story is the relationship with God. And there are some papers actually that do find that this is the case, that a good relationship with a loving God is good for the body, but an active relationship with a judgmental, critical God is not so good for the body. And so there's much more work to be done on this. But it does, what people say, and what really makes sense to me, is that there is this kind of people, when they develop a sense that God is real, when they kindle God into awareness, they develop this kind of real relationship with a invisible being, which works for them like a social relationship. One of the things that I've been doing recently is to spend time with people who develop invisible friends, relationships with invisible others, with no metaphysical framework. Mm-hmm. And so these are folks who they call themselves tulpamancers, kind of like tulip, but spelled a little differently, tulpa. And so they make these relationships with, they set out to create an invisible friend, and they use these prayer-like techniques to create these relationships. And their experience is that this is a real relationship, that it has many of the qualities of a real relation, or a relationship with a person who has a skeleton and clothed with flesh. I mean, they're like a human person. And I'm inclined to think that that is at the heart of some of the health effects of religion.
Mm-hmm. So I asked you about prayer in certain religions and religious contexts, like, for example, in Catholicism, we have something like confession. Does that have also positive psychological effects?
I imagine so. I mean, I certainly would seem to have that relationship in this big health literature. In this huge biomedical literature, sometimes the variables are how much do you pray, and they're not distinguishing between individualized prayer and rote recitation of sacred words. Mm-hmm. So yes, I think that it does.
Mm-hmm. So another question: what is comparative phenomenology, and how can it help the study of religious phenomena?
So I use the phrase comparative phenomenology as a way to describe the comparison of people's accounts of their own phenomenological experience. Mm-hmm. And I've been curious about experiences like voices and visions and waking up in the middle of the night and being unable to move. And I say that this is like clinical interviewing without presuming psychopathology. Mm-hmm. That you're listening, you're trying to understand what somebody is experiencing and trying to describe it as carefully as you can, but from a position of knowing what many, many other people experience. So if you're trying to figure out, what's going on with this person, well, if they say that they're hearing a voice, you want to know, well, how audible was that experience, and why did it not feel like you? How did you know that it was God's voice, rather than your own thought? And so you probe further knowing that there are ways that people talk, ways that other people have talked about these experiences, so you can place that interview participant's experience in the context of other comparable experiences.
Mm-hmm. Could you explain your attentional learning theory of religion?
So that is a theory. So what I'm doing is describing that the kindling, or this experience of increasing realness, arises from the way that people learn to pay attention to their mental experience and their bodily experience and the experience around themselves. So they start with paying attention, and they increase their frequency of the way that they attend to their mental experiences, for example. So say, for example, when people are praying, and so I saw this among my evangelical participants. When people are praying, they are closing their eyes and they are paying attention to their inner experience of sitting with God, or walking with God, or talking with God, or engaging with God. And what they're learning is they're learning to pay attention, and that attention becomes honed and sharpened and organized in particular ways. And what I see is that these patterns of attention and the organization of attention changes the felt realness of the experience. God becomes to feel more and more real. It's not so much about a belief, but a phenomenological experience.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that we have a weird problem in the study of religion? Do you think that anthropologists have been focusing too much on Western versions of religion?
I think actually the problem in anthropology is that anthropologists have not paid attention to the Western versions of religion. The problem in anthropology is that we have paid attention to, shamanism in Amazonia, and witchcraft in the Sudan, and possession in Morocco, and so people have been able to say things that really focus on the problem of false belief. Because you assume that the shaman in the Amazon is not having a true experience, and so that there's just an invitation to focus on what's not, to focus on why are these people believing in something that's not true. I think that one of the advantages of the shift to the anthropology of Christianity has been that it feels very uncomfortable for at least some people in that field to say, oh, the obvious problem here is false belief, because these people, you can't, that just seems very weird to say about your Aunt Mary. Your Aunt Mary is clearly doing something that's more interesting than having a false belief. And so the question is, how can we understand how Aunt Mary comes to experience God as vividly present? And I think that teaches us some ways to think about a religious experience outside of the Euro-American setting as well.
Mm-hmm. So just one last question, and I know that probably they are not taken too seriously by scientists of religion in general. I mean, anthropologists, psychologists, cognitive scientists, and so on. But don't you think that the so-called new atheists have a very misleading view of religion and for example, the harmfulness of religious beliefs, and that they also take too literally people's expressed beliefs or what they think their real beliefs are?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that the interesting issue in understanding Christianity or Judaism is why people believe in talking snakes. That just doesn't get to the, what's really at stake for the person of faith. I mean, you know, the new atheists have a point that religion has been very costly for human experience as well. I mean, most wars are fought, many wars are fought over religious differences, because religion creates a sense of sociality, of, you know, shared sociality. And many wars have been justified in terms of religion, or motivated by a belief in religious differences. So there are many costs to religious practice as well. There, you know, for individuals, you know, many views of God can be profoundly harmful. But over the course, you know, I'm struck by the fact that 2/3 of these 3,000 papers do find this positive effect upon the body. And I am struck by the fact that God does become something like a social relationship for people who are able to experience God. And so, you know, human experience is complicated, messy, you know, it's tough.
Yeah. Okay, so the book is again How God Becomes Real, Kindling the Presence of Invisible Others. Dr. Luhrmann, apart from the book, would you like to reference any places on the internet where people can find your work?
Sure, I have a website called tanyaluhrmann.com, and you could see more of my work there. And I've got a piece that just came out in a Harper's about athletes who experience their coach's voice. And so that's another place to look.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you very much for having me. Great questions.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, hit the subscription button, all of those things you already know. And please consider supporting the show either on PayPal or Patreon. All of the links will be in the description box of the interview, starting at $1 per month, so it would be a great help. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litske and Blanchett, Pererga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Vosbo, Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windager, Rui Narcio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslem Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W. João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Lononio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litske, Denise Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy and Trader in NYC. My producers Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Luis Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus France, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder. And my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Codreanu, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.